just do my homework.
Yeah. You have a bigger place.
You know, I love going.
We'll see what happens. All right. For some reason, my streaming stuff is having issues this morning, and I don't know what it is. Which is always a fun thing to troubleshoot. Lord.
It's usually the one with the hands that are on.
Well, let's see what happens. All right, let's get rolling. If I have to troubleshoot the stream, we'll do it next week. Well, so you're going to get more information than you want, but in a quick minute. So there are multiple streaming platforms. So there's YouTube, which is the one that we use. There's Facebook, you can do Facebook Live, but I resist using that for a couple of reasons. One of which is I dislike Facebook, but the second of which is that there are many things that you can't do, and the quality is horrible, and so YouTube is much better in my opinion. And there are other ones, but not that suit our purposes. The only problem is, in order to do YouTube easily, you have to have some ridiculous number of subscribers, right? So I have to do it the hard way. I mean, I suppose I could solicit my 500 subscribers or whatever I need, but I don't want to do that. But sometimes the hard way just doesn't work. I don't know why. Because I understand generally what the thing is doing, but I don't know specifically what's going on. So
When I had that problem, I found out if I turn it off and turn it back on, it might work.
That doesn't tend to work with this.
Okay. Does it cost to subscribe to YouTube?
No.
They just want.
But wait, because we're in the process. So I've been using my personal YouTube channel to put all the church videos up since the beginning of COVID. We're in the process of creating a church YouTube channel. So when we get that one up and running, subscribe to that one.
Okay.
Don't subscribe to my personal YouTube channel. I mean, it's mostly church stuff, along with I don't know, but those might be private, but like a video I did for my dad's 75th birthday, stuff like that.
So do we just go into YouTube like we had before?
Yeah, it's still in the same place. When we switch to the church YouTube channel, you'll get all the information you need about that. And you won't have to change anything. We'll just change the links that we use on the website. Okay. I erased the board, which hopefully you all remember what we had up there. I'm kidding. So last week we had, again, another really great conversation about this stuff. Really what we got into talking about last week a lot was leadership, which I found was an interesting path to go down. Asking the question, what does a good leader look like? One of the assumptions that I heard in there, assumption is a bad word, but one of the things that we seem to be stating by talking about leadership in terms of discipleship is that part of what being a disciple might entail might include some leadership, right? Which not everybody is excited about. and that's why I want to just talk about this briefly. So one of the things that you also need to do is you need to dissociate leadership from management, right? Those two things aren't mutually inclusive. They aren't mutually exclusive either, but leaders are not necessarily managers, and managers aren't always good leaders, which, well, not to disparage one of our largest employers in the state of Oregon, but Intel has awful mid-level management. and I've gotten to see that firsthand vis-a-vis, peeking over a lens shoulder, well, I don't need to get into that, but suffice to say that engineers don't.
You need to keep her job.
Yeah. Suffice to say that engineers don't, by default, make good managers, and I would say engineers in general don't make good managers. They don't have several very necessary toolkits that you need to be a good manager. Anyways, so what I was getting at is that we talked a lot about leadership last week, which I think is absolutely a vital part of what it means to be a disciple. And we started to talk a little bit about kind of the overarching piece of that. We had a conversation around, witnessing to the resurrection. We had a really great talk about what that looks like. What does it mean to witness to the resurrection? We had some great images that came out of that conversation as well, too. But by nature of what we're doing, when we, again, quote unquote, follow Jesus, it's this weird, almost oxymoron of we used last week, we were talking about the language of servant leaders, is that we're simultaneously following somebody else, but in kind of taking on the role of disciple, we're not necessarily setting an example. There's also a fine line to walk here, but you're also taking on some leadership capacity as well, right? And I think a lot of the time, I promise I'll stop talking here in a sec. I think a lot of the time, the way that I've seen that manifest personally is in sometimes you have to be the responsible person in the room. I don't know if that's a good way to put it. Not that the world is full of evil, misbehaving people, but sometimes being a disciple means being vociferous, means speaking what the right thing is. And we're going to kind of see that in the stuff that we look at today. So anyways, that was just a bit of an introduction to shift your focal lenses, so to speak. So last week at the end of our session, I posed a question to you, which was who? So who gets to be a disciple? Okay. And one of the things, and I don't know if you heard me, we were on our way out, but I said, don't be so quick to jump to everyone. Because sometimes can be kind of very difficult. Who gets to be a disciple? Well, everybody can be a disciple. I don't know that that's necessarily true or expected. And this is not a judgment on people's capacity or righteousness. And this is something that we also need to kind of preface this with, is that when we're talking about being a disciple, are we talking about getting into heaven, or are we talking about something else? Okay. So in other words, let me draw a Venn diagram here, because I love Venn diagrams. One of the things that sometimes Christianity tends to assume, not necessarily Lutheranism, but maybe more on the evangelical fundamental side of things, is that when you talk about discipleship, you've got essentially, okay, I'm just going to say disciples, okay? And then when you talk about those who are quote unquote saved, right? I'm not necessarily espousing that we use that language, but that's the language that you hear. It's the same circle, right? Okay, in other words, you need to be this in order to get to heaven, okay? We don't have to look too far into the biblical witness to realize that that's not necessarily the operating model that Jesus is working with. And I would argue at a basic level that any conversation around quote unquote being saved is a misunderstanding of what Jesus' purpose is. Because, again, at least so far, what we've talked about with regards to discipleship is more about witnessing to things rather than passing judgment on, right? And unfortunately, so often, it seems that a lot of the models of discipleship that get built tend to center around, winning souls. And in winning souls, you're automatically passing a judgment. You're saying that this person whose soul I'm winning was unsaved, was outside of the grace of God before I entered into this. Okay. And this, let's be fair, is not really part of an Orthodox Lutheran theology. Again, we place great emphasis on words of grace, on the idea of faith and our justification coming through the love and relationship of God, not through our actions or our deeds. But we're not immune to to being, I would say, infected, which casts some negative perspective on this. We're not immune to these ideas seeping their way into our culture as well, too. For example, maybe I'm the only person in the room with this, but how many of us grew up with an anxiety around our own salvific status, right? In other words, did anybody else in this room have times in their life where they were worried about whether or not they were going to heaven or hell? Yeah. And would it be fair to say that those fears and anxieties were, if not directly contributed to, but at least assisted by your church experience? Yeah. Okay. I may have told this story before, but I remember, maybe it was 14 or 15, and I was playing baseball for the high school team at the time, so I would have been 15. And I was gone for like 4 consecutive Sundays. I didn't go to church because I had travel games late on Saturday, and I didn't get in until late, slept in, And one Sunday at like noon, the phone rings, landline, right, one of the cell phones, and it's my grandmother, and she was furious because she hadn't seen me in church for 4 Sundays, and to use tore me a new one, right? She couldn't believe it, and I don't remember if she said anything about my personal salvation, but there was definitely this implied threat of, you're walking down a dangerous road, buddy, And again, and that didn't, let's be fair, that didn't fly super well. My dad found out about it, and he got so angry that he went over and wanted to confront my grandma, who locked the door and wouldn't let him into the house. They had an interesting relationship, my dad and his mom. Both wonderful people in their own way. But that is to say that even in this household, in this church community, which was very much a community of grace, right? These are the same people, this church I grew up in, these are the same people that, were putting, $500 checks in our mailbox to pay for my dad's gas when he was driving down to Saginaw every week to see my mom, These are people who embodied a sense of grace. But in the back of our brains still exists this fear of, what do I need to do to make sure I'm on the nice list and not the naughty list, right? So despite what we speak as our theology, that fear exists. When we talk about discipleship, let's do another Venn diagram. So we've got disciples. The question, sorry, I'm laughing at myself already. Because, you could do a Venn diagram that looks like this. Sorry. So those who are saying, again, graph, nerd humor here, which would imply that not all disciples are saved either. But, in reality, I should probably draw a circle like this, right? Okay, so, and notice I didn't necessarily place disciples at the center either. Okay, so when we talk about, the scope of God's redemption, to use a bit more weightier phrase, one of the things that I personally, hang my coat on is the idea that my imagination is not great enough to understand the scope of God's love and redemption, right? Is that I, as a human being, am oft tempted to claim to be able to draw a circle around who I think the good people are and the bad people are. And I have very strong opinions about this, by the way. And yet I will often be surprised by the expansiveness of God's, redemption.
This is such a dualistic way of looking
It
at it.
is.
There's the saved and there's the
It is.
Some of us believe that everybody, but.
And that's my implication here. That's my implication here. And you're pointing at something really important there, Susan, which is, even creating these categories of saved and unsaved is a broken way of looking at things, right? And not how, again, according to our very basic scriptures, not how Jesus relates to the world, right? Does Jesus speak words of condemnation? Yes, but they are almost uniquely leveraged at people who want to claim authority as to these circles of inclusive or exclusivity, right? In other words, it's the people who want to pass judgment on others. Those are the ones that Jesus tends to speak the harshest criticism. But what I'm maybe long-windedly getting at here is when we begin to address this question of who, it's okay for us to acknowledge that not everybody has to experience the call to discipleship. There's no eschatological pressure to do so, right? We don't need to make everybody disciples because we don't have any anxiety to make everybody disciples so that everybody's saved, right? In fact, and Susan, this kind of gets to what you're speaking to. The pressure or the responsibility of thinking that we in any way have agency in saving people is a great misunderstanding of the nature of God and the nature of what it means to be a Christian. In other words, and Paul speaks to this very authoritatively, salvation lies solely in the hands of the divine, right? And again, the first place our brain goes to is, well, how do I figure out who's in there? And this is one of those things where I think that being a disciple means constantly overruling that little voice in the back of your head. And Luther himself would say that that's Satan, that little voice in the back of your head that's making you question, the nature of your own salvation. So I want to get that out of the way because this is the question we're going to explore today: is who not gets to, but who is called to discipleship. Because as we read through our different gospel accounts, one of the pieces that we see is that there is different language used for the different people that are involved in Jesus' ministry. We saw it last week when we were reading from Acts 1. So the disciples realized that they only got 11. Math was not their strong suit. Apparently, they want to make it a nice round 12 again. And so they debate amongst themselves, how do we go about replacing this person? And the requirement seemed to be that it needed to be somebody that was with them from the beginning. Okay? All the way as far back as John's baptism, all the way up through the experience of the resurrected Christ. That was what qualified them to be one of the 12. But the thing that's not explicitly stated there, but is assumed, is that there's this whole cloud of people out there that have been walking alongside the 12 and participating potentially in a path of discipleship, but weren't themselves one of the 12, right? So again, going back to our beloved Venn diagrams, it seems like what we have is we have in the center the 12, and then we have this bigger circle of people who were following Jesus. But it's even a little bit more complex than that, is that there also seemed to be another circle in there, and we'll call them the 70 or the 700, I don't know, right? But there was another group of people who weren't necessarily part of the governing board, but were committed monetarily, committed in terms of supporting the ministry of Jesus, or even committed in terms of identifying themselves as learners of Jesus, but weren't part of this inside group. And then beyond this circle, there's the crowd, right? So we see this especially in Matthew. We've been reading from the Sermon on the Mount. So wherever these folks go, and these folks are the ones that are doing the traveling. These folks are not necessarily following Jesus to every single location, but when Jesus is in town, they make sure to see him. At his next tour date, right? Whatever. They're the roadies, so to speak. But then there's the crowd, which are the incidental people, right? So wherever Jesus goes, especially in his Galilean ministry, there's a crowd that follows him. And here's the really fascinating thing about the crowd, is we have no idea who these people are. We have some suspicions, right? We can kind of make assumptions based on where he's at. I mean, because these aren't people that necessarily took the tour bus to get there, right? They're people that were local, okay? But what we see, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, is this crowd follows Jesus all around the Sea of Galilee in his travels. And I imagine this is an ever-changing community of people, right? Some people will come and see him as he's up, just east of Capernaum. Then they'll go back home and get dinner. When he swings back by across the lake the next week, they might pop over to see him again. But these folks might identify themselves as learners of Jesus as well, but in a different, perhaps, level of, and I don't want to use the word committedness, but level of veracity.
More curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a thank you for remembering one of our words. With a level of great curiosity. This picture only describes up through the gospel narrative. This picture changes significantly when we get into the Acts of the Apostles and after post-resurrection. Because then what happens is that this whole model gets thrown out. So from the 12's perspective, right, what they were trying to do is they were trying to get people, I'll redraw another circle. So this circle includes all everybody now. This is the 12, the 70/700, and the crowds. What they were trying to do is, insofar as this is how they interpreted being fishers of people, is they were trying to get people to follow their curiosity of Jesus. But there was this whole group of people that they understood to be incompatible with that. And this circle, by the way, is much, much bigger than this circle. I just don't have space or this spatial reasoning to make it so. But this people are who we know as the Gentiles, right? Okay, so what was the assumption that they were making about being a learner of Jesus? You had to be Jewish, right? That was the assumption that they were making. And all these folks out here were fundamentally not capable of being curious about Jesus, at least insofar as that's how they understood things to work, right? Because this was a Jewish movement. Jesus was a rabbi, plus more. There was no reason that anybody outside could possibly be a learner. The entirety of the epistles in the New Testament is about reconciling this. So everything from Acts of the Apostles all the way up through Revelation is at least on some level about including the Gentiles into the curious, right? And even into, all the way into the 12, right? So here's the fascinating thing about this. We've still got our concentric circles in here, right? Of the 12, the more, the people that are a little bit more intimately involved in the ministry, and then the crowd. And you essentially overlaid that circle on top of that one. So what happens over the course of time is that you've got some of these folks who they thought before couldn't be in that circle, end up, if not being in this circle, are heavily involved in the leadership aspects of the church, which is mind-blowing and world-ending for a lot of the communities that had formed during this time. when we read our Gospels, and we talked about this when we were talking about the context of the Gospels, one of the things that we see is this happening over the timeline of the Gospels, right? So you've got Mark sometime in the 65 count era, Matthew and Luke sometime in the 90s, maybe the 80s, and then John 90s, maybe hundreds, right? When Matthew and Luke are writing their Gospels, we're watching this happen. We're watching the disciples, but also the disciples come to terms with the idea, number one, that following Jesus might mean leaving behind your Judaism, right? Leaving behind your religious identity. But number two, especially in the Gospel of Luke, that it's not exclusive to the club that it was before. Okay. By the time we get to John, what's happened is that this has begun in full. And now, what you have happening is, well, I don't know if I need to draw circles for this, but you have people realizing that being a disciple, in other words, being a learner of Jesus, might mean leaving behind their Jewish identity. I'm not going to draw anything in there. Okay. Here's the thing, though. That does not put them outside the circle. Okay. Right. And we can draw a squiggly line here because when we talk about that big circle, the expansive circle that tends to defy our capacity for imagination, it doesn't have a rigid boundary. In fact, we could make the argument it doesn't really have any boundaries. Okay. But that's a story for another day. So let's go back to our original question here, half hour now already. Who is called, and not so much who's called, that's language I want to maybe leave behind too. But rather, who becomes disciples? So we can't become members of the 12. We missed our window on that one. We're not around to witness the physical resurrection of Jesus. Plus, the Catholic Church claimed ownership on that one and made the 12 bishops, and so then incorporated that. That's not really what happened, but kind of sort of incorporated that into their leadership structure. But essentially, we have now perhaps a circle of people who are who become disciples, but in this case, we've got this again, amorphous cloud. But in this case, it is perhaps a committed group within that. I'm going to throw out an idea now, but I don't want to necessarily explore this today, but I'm going to plant the seed now. When we talk about following Jesus, which again is what we're exploring here, I imagine, we've already done so, but I imagine what we're going to do as we continue is kind of develop some practices for what that looks like. Maybe some rules. I think we need rules for stuff like that. For example, I've been listening to some podcasts talking about the ways in which the church has been awful in the 20th century. And I'm pretty confident that there are people who should never be disciples of Jesus. Insofar as that they are emotionally incapable of doing so, and they do not have any sense of responsibility or leadership, and ultimately want to be in leadership positions only for their own ends. I'm going to advocate that there are people that should not be disciples. I think Jesus would agree. Because, again, we hear Jesus issue his harshest criticism against those who would take up a mantle of leadership and then use it for nefarious purposes. And those nefarious purposes tend to be excluding others from what they imagine to be the circle. Okay. So, not everybody has to or gets to be a disciple. It's a unique role. I'm going to throw another idea. Okay, wait, hold on. Let me finish the idea I was working with. However, when we talk about discipleship, this committed following, Who are we following? Jesus. I want to put an idea out there, and this might blow our brains a little bit too much, and I'm okay with that. Feel free to debate with me. I'm going to put an idea out there, which is that there are other groups of people whose practices and motivations mirror those of disciples of Jesus, which I imagine are things that we're going to elucidate, or not, that's the wrong word, illuminate as we go through, but might not necessarily name what they're doing as being disciples of Jesus. Okay? These are good people for us to work with. But again, we'll get there. We'll get there, okay? And I'm not necessarily talking about people of other faiths, although that could be in there as well too, right? It could be, people outside of what we think of as religiosity, but are doing the work that disciples do. But we'll come back to that.
Are you talking about people like Billy Graham?
Well, he's a Christian. So he's not a Lutheran, but that's okay. But no, I'm thinking even beyond that. But like Mahatma Gandhi, maybe.
Okay. Hey Jesse, but there's a lot of people. I track what you're saying here, but it seems like if you just look around, say the Portland community,
Yeah.
there are hundreds of like nonprofits and community service organizations of people who actually are not religious at all in any way, and yet they're doing what you're describing. And I'm sitting there thinking about it. They probably outnumber the Jesus circle.
Oh, in Portland? Yeah.
By a factor of 100 or 1,000.
In Portland, absolutely. And here's the thing. Yeah. So for what Matt's saying is, if you look at the Portland area, especially if you just do a survey of the nonprofits that are involved in doing good work in any of our communities, they probably outnumber the ones in the Jesus circle that are necessarily doing the same thing, especially in Portland, right? That slider might shift the other direction and closer to the Midwest you go. Okay, in other words, there are probably more people in the Midwest who would name their inspiration for what they do as being following Jesus. Okay. Here's one sec, Susan. Let me finish the idea. Here's one of the things. This isn't necessarily about me. This isn't necessarily about. Okay. What I'm not saying is I'm not saying that we're trying to build a discipleship model that transcends Christianity. I'm not saying that. Okay. What I'm saying is that there are other people who might be doing similar work to what disciples of Jesus do. And those are people that we absolutely want to work with and value. But we're doing a thing that, by nature of who we are, is unique insofar as our center is this. Okay? So when we talk about building a model of discipleship, it's a little bit different than just doing good. Does that make sense? Okay? And it's not about us being special or better or anything in that, but it's about understanding exactly what this is about. Because otherwise, we could just, this wouldn't be a class about discipleship. This would be a, community ethics course, I don't know, or why you should, volunteer at your local nonprofit course. Yeah. Sorry, I may have confused everybody. Susan, you had.
I'm thinking about the He Gets Us campaign.
Yes.
He gets us.
Yes, us. And it's G's us. G's and then an emphasis on us.
Okay, I don't watch much TV.
Yeah.
I've only read about it myself, but,
And I don't know who sponsors it.
well, it's very right-wing Christian nationalist, anti-LGBTQ group, but the things they're promoting are all things that you probably agree with on their ads.
Huh.
Anyway,
I am totally oblivious.
that's your
I I will look into
For
it.
example, the immigrants, and they say Jesus was an immigrant.
Which is not technically, well,
When he was in Egypt.
yeah, for some time.
And that he had to escape.
Yeah. If you're, like, and this is one of those things where if you're making an argument that we should be more kind, compassionate, and welcoming to those who are migrants, immigrants, yes. But from an exegetical standpoint, I'm not necessarily sure we can make the argument. But again, this is my scholarly brain. I could come up with 100 better reasons biblically why we should support our immigrants, both documented and undocumented.
Well, I think, at least this is my point of view,
Okay.
the commercials are leading more toward teaching people to be kind to other people.
Okay.
That's my view of the commercials.
Which this is something we're going to talk about because that word came in last week, kindness. We're going to come to that. Okay. Susan.
The idea of our focus being Jesus, it's in large part focusing on Jesus' ways.
Yes.
Jesus' ways. We're not, it's, with the way you put it, it sounds like he's an idol, but we.
Sorry.
Jesus, and, maybe that's true. We talk about the worship songs we sing.
Well, and this is something that I really hope we end up talking about is that, and this came up, or this was kind of how we started the conversation, sort of, was the know about us being disciples is that we don't have a physical Jesus to follow, right? And that was the model of discipleship, at least until, post-resurrection era. So these folks, whether it was the 12 or the 70, 700, or the crowd, were following a human being from spot to spot, right? Obviously, we can't do that. There's no physical human being, okay? So by nature, what we're doing is we're talking about following Jesus figuratively. The danger in that, which I think you're speaking to, Susan, is in lieu of having a physical Jesus to follow, there is a temptation to create a concrete image of Jesus that we replace the living Jesus with, right? We don't say we're doing that, but that's functionally what we're doing. So we all do this, by the way. Some of us do it more happily than others. But all of us have an image of who God is, or who Jesus is. And we talk about the Jesus that now reigns at the right hand of God. Who is that? If I am in a personal relationship with Jesus, what does that look like? There has to be somebody there. And so we contrive in our minds who that person is. I would argue that 99.999% of the time, that image of Jesus probably looks a lot like us, right? Okay? And the broken part of that is where we say, well, that's who Jesus is, to the exclusivity of those who see a different Jesus, right? When we talk about following the ways of Jesus, right, or the teachings of Jesus, that's literally what discipleship is about. Jesus, takes on the role of rabbi, disciples are the learners who follow him. Again, the struggle is that we have 2,000 years of context that separate us from the teachings of Jesus. So there is, arguably some interpretation we have to do there too. However, this isn't just about teachings. And I guess this is what I was getting at. There are people who absolutely follow the teachings of Jesus, but they might not necessarily articulate it that way. And this is the way I look at it. So I'm not saying this in the manner of this is the way that you have to see it, or if you see it differently, you're wrong. But for me personally, it's something beyond just following the way of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. And again, this is going to sound really vague and woo-woo, but I, in my own way, am also trying to follow the person of Jesus, despite the fact that I don't have a physical person to follow. Which is, we've come up with some language that helps with that. We talk about being the imago Dei, the image of God. So I'm trying to embody Christ in my own actions. But, for me, the way that this manifests, and I'm jumping ahead a bit, but is, I think one of the roles of being a disciple is seeing Jesus in others, right? Seeing Jesus in the world around me. But that's a big task, right? And that would be an 8-week course in itself. Andy, you had your hand up back there. Right as you put a cookie in your mouth.
A question.
Yeah.
It's going back to sort of the image of Jesus, and that is there any reference in the scriptures that Jesus states to praise him?
Can you repeat what he said?
Yeah, this is great. Yeah. Andy asked a question: is there any point in the scriptures in which Jesus indicates that one of the roles of those columns is praise? Not explicitly. No. Man alive. Andy, this is a whole other can of worms, man. This is a great question for us to struggle with. Especially as people for whom one of the major expressions of our Christianity is through praise and worship. Okay? Which, you can make the argument, is pretty much core and central to who we are.
Right, but the thing is, that's religion.
Yeah.
And it is not what Jesus.
So you're 100% right, man. In fact, I mean, this is okay, and this is also why we're talking about these circles, is that, and again, I hope as we get towards the end of these 5 weeks, I gotta quit saying this. We'll get where we get to, but I imagine one of the things that we're gonna talk about is the fact that if we were to create checklists, right, of what being a modern worshiping Christian looks like, and being a disciple looks like, there are some commonalities in here, but there are also some things that aren't in this column, that are in this column, and aren't in this column, but are in this column. Does that make sense? And I would love to believe that we could reconcile those two columns, but again, I think when we try to do that, we ultimately end up hurting things, rather, because you end up compromising, right? Being a disciple of Jesus has some pretty inflexible, not rules, but commitments. Everybody's loved by God. And anybody that wants to participate in worship and praise of our Lord or exercise their curiosity absolutely should have the space to do so. But when we conflate these two things, it takes the punch away from what this means. And here's the other thing, I didn't get to this. You don't have to always be a disciple. In fact, I would advocate that when we talk about this role of disciple, is it something that's permeable as well too? You can move into and out of that, right? There are times of your life when you will greatly exercise your discipleship, and there are times of your life when, hey, I just need to sit back. I'm going to be in the crowd for a bit. I'm going to show up, get the free fish, and call it a day. And you know what? And that's going to have to be good enough, right? And God still loves me, and that's all I need to know. Okay, what time is it? Okay, I want to read a little bit of scripture since I said I need to pull out your Bibles. And this is just kind of a fun way of exploring this. Okay, so I'm actually working. I'm sorry to do this to you. I'm actually working with 3 different passages at the same time, because that's how I roll. So we're looking at Mark chapter 2, starting at verse 13. And maybe just put your thumb in that, or open to that one. And we're looking at Matthew chapter 9, don't omit verse numbers, please. Starting at verse 9. And we're looking at Luke, what's it, chapter 5? I think it was 5. Yeah, chapter 5, verse 27. And this is
what?
Luke 5, starting at verse 27. This is one of the most confusing pieces of nomenclature in the Bible. And this came up briefly when we were doing our context of the gospel study. We were talking about the Gospel of Matthew and who the author of Matthew was. And there's a really good argument that it's not actually Matthew, but Levi. So in the three synoptics, this doesn't show up in John. In the three synoptics, we have three different stories about the same discipleship event, which is the calling of Levi, the calling of Matthew. Okay. I've read a lot of stuff about this, and not many scholars really want to commit to one definitive statement on this, primarily because we don't really have anything to nail down here. The question at hand is, it seems, at least according to the synoptics, that these are all the same stories. Okay, so the calling of Levi, which is in Mark and Luke, and the calling of Matthew, which is in Matthew, that they're all very similar. I mean, they're essentially copying and pasting each other here. Except the Gospel of Matthew refers to the person as Matthew and is written by the Gospel author, Matthew. Okay? We're not necessarily here to debate whether it's Levi or Matthew, but this is intended to help us kind of explore some more of this question of who. So you're in Mark, right? Hopefully. So Mark chapter 2, verse 13. Jesus went out again beside the lake. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. Okay, so here's this crowd language again. Okay. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. Okay, pause quickly there. Okay, very reminiscent of the other call narratives, right? Matthew, Mark. Jesus goes to Peter, James, and John, says, "Follow me." And they're like, "Okay, let's go." Immediately. Here, Jesus walks up to Levi, who's sitting in the tax booth. Okay. Whoa. And again, not being Jewish citizens of the first century Common Era, the impact of this probably doesn't carry the same weight as it might have. But this is a pretty profound sentence. This is one of the most profound sentences in all of the Gospels, that Jesus walks up to the tax booth and says to Levi, "Follow me." And we have talked extensively about the role and the perception of tax collectors in Jewish society. So Levi gets up and follows him. Verse 15. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Okay, full stop. So Jesus walks up to a guy sitting in a tax booth, says, "Become one of my disciples." And then seemingly, according to the text, because Jesus calls Levi, a bunch of Levi's friends end up following Jesus. Okay? But notice who his friends are. They're other tax collectors and sinners. Okay. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners, listen, they don't even know that these people are following. He's eating with sinners and tax collectors. They said to his disciples, which now includes Levi, by the way. They said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but the sinners." Okay, when we talk about who's called, one of the words we need to put up there is sinners. And I love this. I think this is probably one of the most important pieces. One of the words we had up here from before was the word humility, but this is a little bit more on the nose, isn't it? Right? In the remaining 5-ish minutes here, what does that mean? What does it mean that Jesus calls sinners to follow him? And as we're building our model of discipleship, what does it mean that one of the requirements of being a disciple of Jesus seems to be that you're a sinner?
We're all sinners.
Sure. You could definitely make that argument. I think there are some that would disagree with you. and I'm not saying that snarkily.
There's only one person that was perfect, and he died on the cross.
I don't disagree with that either.
Well, I think if he walked today down the street, I would hope he'd call me, you know.
Yeah.
Just because I'm not perfect.
Well, start building your tax booth, Cheryl.
I pay it every year.
Yeah. Paula.
I missed most of this, so I might be repeating, but I think,
Why were the Pharisees there? And if they were sort of hypocritical, sort of in the sinner camp, and needed repentance, is there anything there?
Yeah, but you're seeing that picture from 10,000 feet, right? I mean, what's going on here is and again, this is the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. This is chapter 2, right? So we haven't even got into the real conflict with the Pharisees yet. But Pharisees were essentially the major group, that was the major religio-political identity in Israel at that time. So Pharisees weren't necessarily a group with membership. It was a political philosophy, a religious political philosophy that people ascribed to. And kind of at the core of that was this idea that being a Jew did not mean following the temple. It meant enacting the law of Moses in your own life, amongst a lot of other things. So, in fact, Jesus would have probably been trained in the Pharisaic tradition and or identified personally as a Pharisee in some regards. What Mark is getting at, and Matthew and Luke, okay, is there's a lot of things. One is introducing the idea of the scribes and the Pharisees, which become adversarial later on in the Gospels. But in this case, and sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded explanation. What I think Mark is doing here is, and you notice the verbiage, he says the scribes of the Pharisees, indicating that these are professionals, okay? So these are the working, these aren't just people who identify philosophically with the Pharisaical tradition. These are people who are actually working in that work. Okay? What Mark is doing here is introducing this idea that what Jesus is involved in, even from the beginning, starts to conflict with the status quo, right? So the majority of people, again, identify the Pharisaical tradition. Here are for lack of a better word, the managers of the Pharisaical tradition, and they are taking issue with the things that Jesus is doing, which again, what they're taking issue with centers around this concept, okay? And I had intended to talk all about this today. We had some other wonderful conversations. This is going to be what we're going to talk about next week. But this is the thing that I want to explore, okay? What does that mean in terms of a sense of following Jesus, a sense of discipleship? Okay? Paul struggles with this too, right? Paul's like, should we sin more so that grace may abound? In other words, does if one of the qualifications of being a disciple is being a sinner, does that mean that we? Sorry, I can go a lot of bad ways with this, right? Should we start knocking over banks to build our bona fides for being? Does this mean that we should swear more? Whatever you include in your personal concept of sinfulness. Does this mean that we should be worse people to be better people? Obviously I'm being snarky, but I don't think that's what this is about. But again, notice, and do I have 1 minute? I have 1 minute. Good. So just flipping to the other accounts of this. So Luke 5, same thing. He goes up to Levi in the tax booth, says, "Follow me." Levi gets up and follows him. Then what we get is Levi throws a great banquet for Jesus, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table. And then meanwhile, the Pharisees and their scribes are complaining, "Why do you eat?" Blah, blah, blah. Then quotes the same, no need for a physician stuff. Matthew, same exact narrative, sees Matthew instead of Levi sitting at a tax booth, says, "Follow me," gets up and follows him. They go to have dinner. Many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him. Pharisees see this, they gripe. When they heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." And then he says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I've come not to call the righteous, but sinners." So this is the other thing we're going to explore today, but we'll do it next week, is that Matthew adds this little line in, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Okay, sorry to drop the bomb on you right before we leave, but think about this week. Think about what that indicates about this role of discipleship within the broader picture, right? No, I'm gonna say too many things. Think about it. We'll talk. We'll cross that bridge next week.